All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm recording this for the second time right now. Welcome to a deeply belated lecture. I think it's raining like crazy outside, so hopefully you can hear the quiet rumbles of the thunderstorm behind me. Welcome to a very belated lecture. This week, we're going to start our second unit for this course on typography. Typography is the visual arrangement of words to express informational hierarchy, to make them more readable, and to deepen their possibility of meaning. Before we go deeper into what typography is, let's talk about what typography isn't. Typography is not drawings made out of letters. Typography is not the practice of cutting and pasting letters from magazines to make ransom notes. And lastly, good typography goes beyond merely good penmanship. I'll go into more detail about this later. Typography is a massive and evolving set of practices, conventions, software, systems, discourses, and debates. In this course, we'll only be skimming the surface of this massive field. In graphic design, for example, you have to take upwards of 3 courses before you can graduate. So here's a tiny taste of what might be considered typography that we're not actually going to touch. We're not going to have time to talk about ornament and type and letterpress, things like wedding invitations and other sort of craft-oriented forms of typographic practice. We're not going to talk about hand-drawn lettering, such as this cool-ass band logo from Toronto's greatest death metal band, Tomb Mold. And we're definitely not going to have a chance to talk about the actual design and production of typefaces. So let's talk about what we are going to talk about, or namely, what is typography for the purposes of this course. Typography is the art and technique of arranging type and letter forms to make written language legible, readable, and understandable. Typography refers to the practices and variables of setting text in books, online, on posters, in spaces, basically anywhere you see text that has been produced or reproduced for public consumption, that's typography. In other words, typography is language made visible. But this is something that isn't historically taught to industrial design students. So I want to articulate why this is important to know some of the typographic fundamentals. First off, when we talk about process, specifically for OCAD U students, your university career will rely on how accurately you're able to document the work that you've done and showcase your process. As students, you'll regularly ask to articulate your work and your process in the form of process books, systems maps, design plans, blueprints, and so on. An understanding of typographic hierarchy will help you make these into understandable and visually engaging forms. As designers, physical products and digital products are increasingly interwoven, and you will need to master both. Type is fundamental to the design of information on screens, and generally being able to communicate visually. Type is used both in and around our design work, more or less depending on what we choose to specialize in. In design work, type can appear on a label, through an interface or user experience element, as an element of branding, or any number of other applications. Around design work, type is used when creating pitches, presentations, talking about or promoting your work, or visualizing your data or research. Let's take a very brief moment to quickly review some of the first moments in the history of typography. This is a cuneiform tablet. It was created through the drawing of using a reed to carve into clay and then baking that clay. This is one of the earliest known forms of writing, and it's a mixture of abstract glyphs and more representational pictograms, initially used for accounting and trade. In this system, markings refer to the concepts rather than phonetic sounds. Books have existed for thousands of years. Originally, books were manuscripts. That is, each page was individually written on by scribes. Because this was so labor intensive, books were expensive and literacy was reserved to only the nobility and the clergy. And it wasn't until the development of the printing press that books could be produced quickly and much more cheaply. You may have noticed that I said the word development and not invention. We'll talk about that shortly. This is a page spread from the Gutenberg Bible from 1450. This is considered to be one of the first books, or this is considered to be the first book ever to be mass produced. 5,000 copies were initially printed. Very quickly, printing presses spread around the world with literacy catching up and new typographic forms being developed. Newspapers, advertisements, public records, etc. The key invention of Johannes Gutenberg was these individual letters known as sorts, which could be reassembled into words and sentences and entire pages, which were then coated in ink and then pressed into paper. And you could do this in repeated cycles. To this day, there's still letterpress printers throughout the world. This is known as movable type. When we talk about typography, we're usually talking about letters and their reproduction. And this is why I like to say that typography is beyond good penmanship, because typography relies on that act of reproduction. And that's that is the moment of transition between the culture of writing and the culture of printing words. In the West, movable type was largely attributed to Johannes Gutenberg, but it was deployed long before the 15th century in both China and Korea. Today, typefaces and forms have been constructed out of almost all written languages. Here's a sculpture by the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation artist Joy T. Arcand, currently on view at the Winnipeg Art Gallery. It says, "He or she speaks Cree." This is known as the Cree syllabic system, attributed to be constructed around the mid-19th century. Often attributed to missionaries, it's now integral to the preservation of First Nations languages and culture today. Back in normative type history, let's talk a little bit about this machine. This is the linotype machine. It was invented in the 19th century as a mechanism to rapidly set type. What you'll notice is there's a keyboard. The keyboard, a user would press a keyboard, it would unleash a die that would come down into a line. Over time, you could type out a whole sentence and it would create a cast of that line out of hot lead. Once it cooled, you could place it into a printing press and print a letter. This made newspaper production faster and ultimately sped up the pace of information moving around the world. If we skip ahead almost a century, we get to the development of digital typography in the 1970s by Donald Knuth, a computer scientist based out of Stanford in California. Upset with the way that his book looked after being used in a photostat machine, he started to experiment with with computational typographic systems. On the left is an early drawing by a computer trying to use the same variables as a pen. So the letter has the letter is comprised of a stroke, curves, the pen angle, and various shapes. This system was known as Metafont. To this day, Metafont still exists, but it's not a part of normative digital typography. Instead, we mostly rely on systems like the one we see on the right, which is how most letter forms are drawn today. Developed as an outline shape, like a vector drawing in Illustrator. Here you can see anchor points and control points like we learned in the last unit. The last typographic artifact that I wanted to showcase today is this. This is the world's first website. The World Wide Web was built to be a purely typographic medium. In essence, it exists as text that's been augmented by the ability to immediately link to other texts. This is known as hypermedia or hypertext. Built into the World Wide Web programming language is a fundamental typographic hierarchy. It has multiple levels of headers, links, block level elements, inline elements, paragraphs, superscripts and subscripts, all meant to clearly articulate different typographic forms. Anyone who's ever used HTML before is familiar with the H1, H2, H3, and so on system. The main thing that I want you to take away from this is that typography is systematic, that you can apply rules to the visual presentation of information, and it will help your reader navigate them if they can clearly and intuitively understand them. Take, for example, this 2-page table of contents spread. Very closely, you're going to see how rules are being over-applied, or how the rules are being applied on these pages. What I see are multiple levels of typographic hierarchy, which clearly articulate various key elements. So we see section titles are the largest, feature interviews, Otis residency, and directory. These are the biggest items on the page, and they're set in a sans serif typeface. Then you have the individual chapters or articles. Each one of these articles has an associated page number that's the exact same size, aligned all the way to the right, also set in sans serif. Every article is then, every article section, in order to articulate which sections sit within other sections, a tabbed system is set to ensure that letters do not crash into each other. Lastly, there are the running heads and running feet, which give you some navigation element information on the page. Page 4, table of contents, page 5, and so on. Clearly, there's a very distinct typographic system at play. We'll be digging deeper into the history and structure of letter forms in future weeks, but for the time being, let's start with some very basic first principles to help you with this week's homework. The Canadian typographer and writer Carl Dare wrote a famous book in the mid-century, in the 1960s, called Designing with Type. In that book, he articulated 7 types of typographic contrast. Nothing in typography is a hard and fast rule, but these are always helpful guides in order to set type well. So let's go through in anticipation of this week's homework, we're going to go through the 7 types of typographic contrast right now. Let's begin with size. Contrast of size provides a point to which the reader's attention is drawn. Set in the same style of type, it maintains the exact relationship of the letter to the background. It is only a physical enlargement of the basic pattern created by the form and the weight of the type being used for the text. The most common use of size is in making the title or heading noticeably bigger than the text, but that's only a starting point. So here's in this 2-page spread, we see the word splendid isolation, much larger than the rest of the text. The second type of typographic contrast is weight. Not only shapes of varying weight, but other typographic materials such as rules, spots, squares, etc. can be called into service to provide a heavy area for a powerful point of visual attraction or emphasis. Here in this image, what you'll see is that a title is articulated by using a bolder weight of the exact same font. Everything else is the same size. Contrast of form. By form, Dare means the distinction between capital letters and its lowercase equivalent, or a Roman letter and its italic variant. As you can see here, titles are articulated through contrast of size, but also through a contrast of form, where they're always articulated through in all capitals. It also uses a contrast of direction, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. The use of contrast of structure may be compared to an orator who changes his voice or her voice to increase or decrease the volume, but to change the very quality of their voice to suit their words. So contrast of form refers to, or contrast of structure is the actual structure of the letters themselves. Here we see an interview between two people. The interview questions are set in a typeface that is a sans serif typeface, whereas the actual answers are set in serifs. This creates two distinct typographic voices in dialogue with each other. Once again, these two voices are the same size, are set in the same size. Texture. If we put all these things together and apply them to a block of text on the page, and you come to a contrast of texture, the way the lines of type look as a mass, which depends partly on the letter forms themselves and partly on how they're arranged. Like threads in a cloth, says Dare, type forms the fabric of our daily communication. So this is a page spread from the famous Emigre magazine from the 90s. If you squint, you can see that the type on one page is significantly lighter than the other. A variety of factors contribute to this. On the right page, you have a much lighter weight of font, whereas on the left page, you have a much lighter weight of font, and on the right page, it's a much darker font. Also, the leading, or the vertical space between the lines, is much wider on the left side than the right side. So as you squint, you see a much darker color, a much darker shade of gray on the right side as opposed to the left side. That is a contrast of texture. Color is a pretty easy one. Dare's 6 contrast. He warns that the second color is usually less emphatic than a plain black on white. So it's important to give careful thought to which element needs to be emphasized and pay attention to the tonal values of the colors used. This won't be so useful for at least for the first couple weeks. Take a look at this book. The title is set in black and the author is set in white. This clearly articulates two distinct types of information by only using a color shift. Lastly, changing directions can have a dramatic effect on the layout, but Dare points out that text blocks also have their vertical and horizontal aspects. Mixing wide blocks of long lines with tall elements of short lines can also produce a sharp contrast. This is a poster by Micah Barrett. What you'll notice is it employs contrast of direction, contrast of weight, contrast of size, contrast of color, or contrast of texture, and so on and so forth. So at least a few of these will be very useful for the first assignment coming up. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me as always, and stay tuned for the next couple days for the next lecture on typography. Thanks, everyone.